Hi everyone, I'm back to read the next American Girl doll book from the historical collection. This one is Happy Birthday Kirsten, a springtime story, book 4 from 1854. We'll go ahead and start. This one, it says, Happy Birthday Kirsten. Exciting new things come to the Larsons farm in Minnesota in the springtime, including a big new barn and a tiny new baby. But changes bring new worries and more work for Kirsten too. First, she is afraid for Mama's health. Then caring for a baby keeps her so busy that her life seems to be nothing but chores. Soon, Kirsten doesn't even have time to help with the surprise she and her friends are planning for their teacher, Miss Winston. And when she has to miss school to help out at home, she worries that her friends will forget her. But Kirsten's hard work is rewarded, and her 10th birthday becomes a celebration of family and friendship. Okay, and we'll go through the characters again. We have Kirsten, a 9-year-old who moves with her family to a new home in America's frontier in 1854. There's Papa, Lars, Mama, and Peter. The Larsons sometimes long for Sweden, but they never lose heart for the challenges of pioneer life. And friends, Miss Winston, Kirsten's teacher, who lives with Uncle Olaf's family. And we have Anna, Aunt Inger, Lisbeth, and Uncle Olaf. Kirsten's American relatives live on a new farm in Minnesota where they make the Larson family feel at home. Okay, chapter 1 is called Tornado. Hit your rug harder, Anna called to Kirsten. Look, I can make more dust fly than you can. It makes me sneeze, Kirsten said. But she liked smacking the red carpets that Mama and Aunt Inger had draped over the line. She grinned as she slapped the dirt out of with her small branch from the maple tree. Anna held her branch with both hands. Because she was only 8, the youngest of the girls, she'd been given the smallest rug. The tip of her nose was as pink as a cherry blossom from the sun and the work. After the long winter, the clothes, bedding, and rugs were full of dirt and soot, but Kirsten and Anna laughed and chattered as they beat the rugs. Elizabeth called, "Hello," as she brought bed linens from the big house to where Mama and Aunt Inger were doing the laundry. They were all so glad it was warm enough to be outside. The Larsons' first winter in America had been bitterly cold, but at last the deep snows of Minnesota melted, and now May greened the farm Kirsten's family shared with Uncle Olaf and Aunt Inger. Papa, Lars, and Uncle Olaf were working the fields so they could plant wheat and corn. As soon as the seed was in the ground, the men would raise a new barn. That would be wonderful, Kirsten thought. A big new barn and a barn-raising party. But first there was so much work to be done. Kirsten sneezed again as she stopped to wipe her nose on the corner of her apron. The strong wind on the prairie, whipped her skirts around her legs and pulled Anna's braids straight back from her head. It fanned the flames under the steaming laundry kettle where Mama and Aunt Inger stirred the sheets. As Peter brought the cows in to be milked, his cap blew off his head and tumbled across the barn lot. Mama scooped up the cap as it rolled to her feet. Then she looked at the sky in alarm. Kirsten looked too. All day the sun had shone, but now the sky was getting dark as though night were coming early. Mama waved Kirsten to her side. She put her wet, warm hand on Kirsten's shoulder. "Those black clouds worry me," Mama said. Aunt Inger shaded her eyes to study the horizon. "Another tornado might be coming," she said. "Last spring a tornado ripped up the woodlot and almost took that old barn. We should go into the root cellar to be safe." Even as Aunt Inger spoke, the wind blew several shingles off the roof of the little barn. "Get your brother and your cousins, Kirsten," Mama said. "Hurry." The wind shoved Kirsten as she ran to the barn lot. "Come quickly," she called to Elizabeth and Anna. "That might be a tornado." The pine trees thrashed, the tall grass flattened, and the wind howled as black clouds sped toward the farm. If a tornado touched down here, it could destroy the house and the cabin and the barn and everything in them. It could carry away the pieces of the new barn that hadn't even been put up yet. Kirsten grabbed Peter's hand. A tornado! We have to get underground to be safe. Come to the root cellar. No one had to be told twice to hide from a tornado. Peter picked up the gray cat Missy and ran after Kirsten. Mama was already at the back of the big house, opening the door to the root cellar. Anna and Elizabeth scrambled in like prairie dogs into a burrow. Aunt Inger came with a lantern and the family Bible in her arms. Right behind her ran Miss Winston, the school teacher, who was staying with the Larsons. She held a quilt over her head and shoulders like a cloak. Peter skidded into the root cellar with Kirsten right behind him. Then Mama and Miss Winston crowded in, and Aunt Inger dragged the door shut behind her and bolted it tightly. Where are Lars and Papa and Uncle Olaf? Kirsten asked. They're helping at the Petersons' farm today, but don't worry, the men will lie down in a ditch if they see a tunnel cloud coming, Aunt Inger said. Here, turn over a bucket and sit down. She lit the lantern and set it by her feet. Everyone huddled together, shoulder to shoulder, in the little room dug out of the earth under the house. Last fall, the root cellar had been packed full of potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, and apples. During the winter, the families had eaten almost all the vegetables. Now there were only a few wrinkled apples left. Aunt Inger picked them up and handed them around. These will have to be our lunch, she said. We can't go out until danger is past. Aunt Inger held the family's Bible in her lap. It was the most important thing the Larsons owned. Every night, Uncle Olaf or Papa read from it. In the front of the Bible, the names and important dates for everyone in the whole family were written. Kirsten liked to read her own birthday there. Kirsten Larson, born June 8, 1845. Ride, Sweden. In a month, Kirsten would be 10 years old. Kirsten was too nervous to eat the apple that Aunt Inger had given her. Outside, the wind roared and howled like the train that had brought her family across the country to their new home. What would they do if the tornado blew their cabin away? And Mama was going to have a baby soon. Where would the baby be born if they didn't have a home? Kirsten pressed against Mama's side. Miss Winston pulled her quilt from her head and smoothed her hair. In Maine, we never ever had a tornado. No one will believe me when I write home about these dangers. But she smiled to show them that a ship's captain's daughter knew how to be brave. Anna touched the corner of Miss Winston's quilt. Couldn't you find your cloak? She asked. Anna was never too scared to be curious. I never thought about my cloak. I just knew I had to save my quilt. So I took it and ran. Miss Winston sat up straight like a lady and smoothed the quilt in her lap. Every time I look at my quilt, it's like getting a letter from home. You were right to save it, Aunt Inger said. It's beautiful. Kirsten had often seen the brightly colored quilt on Miss Winston's bed, but she'd never looked at it closely. Now she leaned forward to study it. It was white and covered with designs that looked like wreaths of flowers. Each design was made from small pieces of fabric. The whole quilt was sewn with tiny, perfect stitches, the kind of stitches Mama was teaching Kirsten to make. It must have taken a long time to sew, Elizabeth said. She was 12, and her sewing was already like a grown woman's. Anna shuddered when the wind huffed at the door. Did you make your quilt, Miss Winston? She asked in a small voice. Oh, no. Shall I tell you how this quilt was made? Miss Winston said. Anna nudged Kirsten's foot with hers, because Miss Winston never missed a chance to teach a lesson. Yes, please, Anna said. It did take a long time to sew, Miss Winston said proudly. My mother and my aunts and my cousins and my sister made this quilt for me. They gave it to me to remember them by when I left home. She pointed to the flower designs in the quilt. The pink cloth in the center of the flower is from my sister's old apron. The cloth in this green leaf is from a dress of my mother's. and the yellow cloth for the flower petals came from a dress that I wore as a baby. It was hard for Kirsten to imagine Miss Winston as a baby, but she liked the quilt's lively colors. They made her think of wildflowers in the meadow. Everyone who helped make this quilt signed her name to it, Miss Winston said. It's a friendship quilt. Her eyes had a faraway look, as though she were gazing at her friends and family back in Maine instead of the dirt walls of the damp root cellar. Do you think you could teach us to sew a quilt? Kirsten asked, whenever she admired something she wanted to do herself. Yes, could you? Elizabeth echoed. Miss Winston raised her eyebrows. Haven't I taught you sums and readings and recitation and penmanship? Of course I can teach you to make a quilt. A big one like mine would be difficult, but you could each make a small square. I have some white muslin in my trunk. I'll cut 3 pieces for the background. Anna nudged Kirsten's foot again as the girls looked at each other excitedly. But what can we use for making the designs? Kirsten asked. You'll need only small bits of cloth for that, Miss Winston said. Just scraps will do. We can use my worn-out kerchief, Anna said, and scraps from the red rag bag, Lisbeth added. My apron can't be patched anymore. We could cut it up for scraps, Kirsten said. Mama put her hand on Kirsten's knee. You don't have time for fancy sewing, she said. Remember, I need your help to make clothes for the baby. She patted her big belly to remind Kirsten that it wouldn't be long now until they'd need the baby things. Kirsten sighed. It was tiresome to hem shirts and diapers for the baby Mama was expecting. Why did a baby need so many diapers? Surely 3 or 4 would be enough. But quilting trains the hand and eye, Miss Winston said sternly, as though Mama were one of her pupils too. And a quilt is so practical. Mine is wonderfully warm. Mama looked doubtful. Quilting was something new to her. The Swedish women wove their blankets and bed coverings on looms. Maybe Elizabeth and I could learn and teach you when you have time, Kirsten, Anna said. I bet you'll still be able to sew just before bedtime, Elizabeth said. And at school we can sew during recess. I know the other girls would like to do it too. Sewing at recess, what a good idea, Miss Winston said. After you walk about and take deep breaths, I'm sure there will be a little time left for sewing. Where there's a will, there's always a way. She wrapped her quilt around her shoulders again. The gray cat jumped from Peter's lap and curled around Kirsten's ankles. Missy was going to have kittens soon and didn't like to be fussed over now, but Kirsten felt comforted when she petted the cat, so she stroked Missy's soft head. I'll sew the baby things so fast that I know I'll have some time, she told Lisbeth and Anna. It's decided then, Lisbeth said. We'll learn to make a quilt. Who knows what these girls will learn next, Aunt Inger said to Mama. Then she cocked her head. While they'd been talking, the wind had died down. I think it might be safe to go out now, she said. Let's look. She lifted the heavy bolt. The small door swung open onto a patch of sky as blue as one of the pieces in Miss Winston's quilt. All the rugs and covers had blown off the lines, and a few shingles had blown off the rooftops. Broken branches littered the barn lot, but both houses and the old barn stood safe in the clearing among the pines. Mama let out a long sigh, as though she'd been holding her breath. Thank God that this danger has passed us by, she said. They crept out of the root cellar like bears out of a cave into the fresh air. All right, and next we have Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called New Babies. School started again for the summer, and all the girls gathered at recess every day to sew. Kirsten liked to lean against the sun-warmed logs of the schoolhouse and chatter with her friends. They had traded scraps of cloth so that everyone could make a colorful design on the square of white muslin. The designs they made from the bits of cloth slowly grew in their hands the way wild violets bloomed on the prairie. Mary Stewart, whose family had come to Minnesota from Boston, was making the fanciest design. Mary had worked on a quilt before, so when Miss Winston wasn't there to give directions, she helped the others sew difficult corners and curves. She had beautiful curly brown hair and a squinched up face like a sleepy puppy's. Today Mary was showing Kirsten how to make a sharp corner. Her curls brushed Kirsten's braids as they bent over the small piece of blue cloth. "This is a piece of linen my mother wove," Kirsten said. "There was just a tiny bit left after she made a shirt for Papa. Now all she makes are baby clothes. She's making little caps from an old pillowcase." Mary wet her fingers and knotted a piece of thread. "Last year, my Aunt Sadie had twins. Only one of the babies lived, and Aunt Sadie died after they were born." Kirsten made herself concentrate on Mary's quick fingers and the flashing needles. She didn't want to think that Mama was in danger. My mother took Aunt Sadie's baby to raise. We call her my little sister, but she's really my cousin. She never knew her real mother, of course," Mary went on, her lips pursed over her sewing. Kirsten pricked her finger from the needle and sucked hard at the hurt place. Everyone seems to know stories of mothers or babies who had died. Here on the frontier, to think of something happening to Mama made Kirsten want to cry. It was better not to think of that. It was much better to think about the pretty designs they were making. Anna had left the sewing circle to ask Miss Winston to untangle her thread. Now she came running back. Gladly, Kirsten made a place for Anna to sit between her and Mary. Anna pulled her quilt squares from her apron pocket. "Honestly, isn't Miss Winston the nicest teacher ever? I'll be sorry when she has to leave Powder Keg School." Kirsten was startled. She thought Miss Winston would be with them always, like family. "Why would she want to leave?" Kirsten asked. "Teachers always move on," Mary said. "I've been at this school for 4 years, and we've had 4 different teachers. Miss Winston is the only nice one." Anna picked a little white flower that bloomed in the shelter of the log school and held it to her nose. "Miss Winston likes it here. She often says so." "I hope she stays," Kirsten said. She wished that everything would stay just as it was now. The morning light was sweet and clear. The woods were green again, and they were all happy to have Miss Winston with them. If only Mama felt better. That was the one thing Kirsten would change. These days, Mama was as nervous and as irritable as Missy the gray cat. "If Miss Winston does leave, maybe we could add our squares to her quilt. Then she'd remember us too," Anna said. "I can imagine her saying, 'This piece of brown calico is Anna's, and this blue linen is Kirsten's, and this red cotton is Mary's,'" Mary added quickly. "Miss Winston's quilt is finished. When she showed it to us, I saw the fancy border." Kirsten had an idea. "We could make another quilt for Miss Winston, and we could all sign our names to it, just the way her family did. Then when she looks at it, she'll think of all of us." Anna smiled right away. She jumped to her feet and pranced around the circle, lifting her knees like a little pony. "That's a grand idea," she said. But Mary frowned. "It takes a long time to make a quilt. We can't make one in a rush." Kirsten pressed her lips together tightly. Oh, she knew Mary was right. It had taken several days just to cut out a design. Sewing it to the background was taking even longer, and making all the tiny quilting stitches would surely take weeks. Now that there was so much work to do at home, Kirsten had no time to work on her design before bed. Some days Mama's back ached so badly that Kirsten had to stay home from school to help her bake and cook. On those days, Kirsten didn't even get to sew at recess. Still, Kirsten wouldn't give up her plan to make a quilt. "We could sew all the squares together and make a small one," she said. "If we worked fast, we could finish it before summer term is over." "I think we should try," Elizabeth agreed in her slow voice. That meant she was serious. She liked to think things through. So when she said they'd try, Kirsten thought the quilt was as good as finished. But Mary sat back on her heels. She shook her brown curls like a wet dog shaking off water. No, no, no. Kirsten was surprised. Why not at least try? She asked. Mary folded her arms and took her head again. You don't understand. Being finished with a quilt isn't the best part, she said firmly. Making the quilt is the best part. Anyway, that's what I like best, sewing it. All of us together. Kirsten looked at Mary with new respect. Of course Mary was right. When the quilt was finished, the fun of working together would be over. And to be working and talking with her friends made Kirsten happy. Yes, she said, you're right, Mary. Anna stood behind Kirsten. I love your design, she said. It looks just like a heart. It's really a flower, Kirsten said. I want it to look like the flowers Mama gave me to wear in my hair when I turned 8. We didn't celebrate my birthday when I turned 9. We were on our way from Sweden then. Then I'm sure you'll have a big celebration this year, Mary said. 10 is much more important birthday than 9 anyways. Kirsten licked her thread and threaded her needle. Maybe she wouldn't celebrate her birthday this year either. Maybe Mama had forgotten about her birthday. Mama had so much work to do for the new baby and so much on her mind these days. Kirsten wanted to remind Mama, but she had thought it was better not to bother her until after the baby was born. It was better just to help out all she could and pray that Mama would be well. Helping out meant more and more work for Kirsten. The cows gave more milk in the spring, so there was cheese to make and butter to churn. The chickens were laying again, and Kirsten had to feed them and gather eggs. She picked berries and greens to eat too, and cooked breakfast and dinner when Mama wasn't able to be on her feet. Every night when her chores were done, Kirsten went straight to bed and fell asleep. And as soon as she woke in the morning, she started on that day's tasks. There was no time for sewing now. One morning, as Kirsten was milking the cows with Aunt Inger, Elizabeth burst into the barn. Come see Missy's new kittens, she cried. What are you doing here, Elizabeth? You're supposed to be cooking breakfast, Aunt Inger said sternly. The men will be in from the fields soon. They'll be hungry. I was cooking. Then Anna brought the eggs in, and she said that Missy was having her kittens. So I came out to see them. They're so small, they look like mice. Lisbeth wiped her hand on her apron and made herself talk more slowly. Kirsten, maybe you could come take a quick peek. The kittens have made a home in a pile of straw. Kirsten looked at Aunt Inger, who noticed but didn't smile. Milk hissed into her bucket in 2 white streams. Go on then, but be fast about it, Aunt Inger said. We've still got 2 cows waiting. Kirsten jumped up and followed Elizabeth. The sun was just rising, as pink as a primrose. The scent of lilacs and freshly turned earth was in the air. In the barn lot, Anna and Peter crouched beside a pile of straw near a huge wooden beam for the new barn. There was Missy, curled around her 5 baby kittens. Missy licked and licked the kittens, which crawled blindly against her belly to look for milk. 2 of the kittens were black and white. 2 were gray and white, and the smallest one was gray, just like Missy. The gray kitten was so small it couldn't squeeze in to find a place to nurse. Instead, it bumped up against the beam, then against Missy's hind leg. That one's so little it'll never live, Peter said. He'd heard Uncle Olaf say that about one of the piglets. Be quiet, Peter, Kirsten said. You don't know everything. She tried to guide the tiny gray kitten to its mother, but the kitten couldn't find its way. I think it has a chance, Elizabeth said, though sometimes those very little ones aren't strong enough to make it. Kirsten touched the gray kitten's stomach with the tip of her finger. The kitten's heart beat like a flutter of a butterfly wing. Its tiny mouth closed around her fingertip, and Kirsten moved the little kitten closer to Missy. Oh, yes, that kitten will make it, Kirsten whispered. You'll see. You like that one best, don't you, Peter said. Kirsten nodded. Well, I like that black and white one, Peter said. He liked the puppies that were the toughest and the calves that were the biggest, too. I've got to finish milking with Aunt Inger, Kirsten said. Peter, you make sure the great kitten doesn't get lost in the grass, will you? Peter stood up and shoved his hands into his pockets, the way their bigger brother, Lars, did. Missy will take care of our kittens. She doesn't need help. But Kirsten wasn't sure. That gray kitten was so very, very small. She leaned down to pet it one more time and whispered, "Be careful. Don't wander away or a hawk might get you. Drink lots of milk. I'll come back to see you later." She wanted to stay to guard it, but instead she ran back to the barn to help Aunt Inger. All right, and that is the end of chapter 2, and next time we'll read chapter 3.